Good afternoon. It's lovely to be here with you. My name is Kate Bruce, and I currently am the acting warden at Cranmer Hall, where I teach preaching to ordinands and all comers. And I also work with Pete Phillips in Codec, where I'm a fellow in preaching, and I go around the country and do various sessions on preaching, and this is the thing I most love to do. And when I'm not doing all that, I write and perform stand-up comedy. So if it all goes pear-shaped today, we'll bin the preaching and we'll just do some stand-up. So you just tell me, if you're boring us, we'll do something completely different, okay? And I'll try and keep the energy in the room up so that, you don't have the postprandial slump. So this session is called Engaging Preaching Through the Ear You Hear. Excuse me. And I've got some, actually. It doesn't seem to be working. I'm going to think stronger. A bit of gin would do it. So what I want us to do is to consider as preachers how we write for the ear and earth our examples as we go along through the book of James. And then at the end, if there's time, while Pete was doing a session this morning, I'm funnily enough, preaching on a passage from James in a couple of weeks. So I was nicking his ideas and flying through. So I've got to the end of the first draft of a sermon, which if we've got time, I'll chuck out and we'll see if it's exemplifying what I'm trying to teach. Remember, it's the first draft, so be gentle. It's still got a little bit of incoherence in it. Do please come in. You should all have a handout. 2 apologies. On the back sheet of the handout, there is a spelling mistake. I think I put thinks instead of thing. And also, I'm not very good with numbers. The numbering for my practical exercises is completely wrong. We go from 8 back to 7. So apologies for that. So, engaging preaching through the ear you hear. In the age of the digital, the fast-moving image, the all-pervasive camera and the ubiquitous PowerPoint, I want to go into bat, and I hope I'm amongst friends in this, for the enduring power and punch of the spoken word. A couple of years ago, I got a very unlikely invitation to go and speak to a conference of the European Speechwriters Guild. They asked me to go as a preacher. I thought that for a secular organisation, that was pretty forward-thinking. Let's get a preacher to come in and talk about how they use language in communication. It was a fascinating event. There were people there from across Europe who write speeches for the big politicos in Europe, for chairs of banking organisations, CEOs of big business. And only 2 of the presenters, and there were about 20 of us doing sort of 20-minute presentations, only 2 of them used PowerPoint. The rest, and one of those was a guy from Disney, the rest, including me, didn't. And that's really fascinating. It cuts against the wisdom of learning styles. We've been told you should have stuff for the visual learner, except maybe not. Because in this conference, the visual was the speaker. That was the illustration for the visual learner. The speaker inhabiting language with energy and verve and power and punch. So don't get me wrong, I'm not opposed to PowerPoint at all. The only reason I don't often use it is because it usually goes wrong on me. I do use it in teaching and sometimes in preaching, but what I want to say is that effective words are performative. When they are uttered, things happen. Effective human speech has power and punch in and of itself. There's no question about that. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new generation. That should be nation, but never mind. Ask not what your country can do for you. Never was so much owed by so many to so few. I have a dream. There was a man, and he had 2 sons. Effective human speech has transformative power. So let's not sell out to the digital image, as important as the digital image can be. Language can transform the base metal of the mundane into the gold of new apprehension. Words can cause the heart to catch. Words can cause our eyes to glimpse new vistas of possibility. Words can open up that moment of disclosure when the penny drops. Now I see it. Now I get it. The lights go up and we see things as we've never seen them before. Words do things. but, you might say, and there's always an but. Don't words have the capacity to bore us to death? Well, we'll see how you're doing in 20 minutes' time. The flattened blah, blah, blah of the predictable, stale words, mouldy language, the empty yada, 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 which, let's be honest, sometimes we sit in church and listen to a sermon and that's what we think. Meanwhile, we're all getting older. We've heard it all before. Come on, give us something new, preacher. And there's another but. Don't words have the capacity to distort reality and airbrush out inconvenient truths? Alternative facts, people. Alternative facts. They're called lies. A dead body, I keep doing that now, that's terrible, isn't it? Stop it. A dead body is still someone's son or daughter, whether you call that body collateral damage or not. If a man is part of a swarm, is he still a man? Has he not been rendered as an insect? And isn't an insect very easy to swat, to stand on, to eradicate? We need to beware the power of language, because a bullet in the head is still a bullet in the head, whether you call it friendly fire or not. So words can bring us to death, never mind bore us there. Preachers, we are wordsmiths. We need to consider the power and potential and the risks inherent in language. Language has the power to distort. This came home to me really clearly a few years ago. I was reading a history book, and in this history book, there was a copy of a letter. It was a customer's letter to the managing director of a factory. And in it, the customer was complaining to the manufacturer about a fault in a lorry. Because what happened was, when there was shifts in the freight in this lorry, the cargo shifted and went to one corner of the lorry, and it was very unstable. It didn't function properly. So the customer was requesting a redesign of the stability of the axle to cope with movements in the freight. All very innocent, you might think. Until you realize that the letter is from a Nazi commandant, the lorry was one of the forerunners to the gas chambers, and the cargo were Jewish people. But the letter had eradicated out any humanity. Cargo, load, not people. Language has power to distort and dehumanize. Theologian Garrett Green defines sin as bad imagining. And these examples of distorted language use can be seen as the fruit of bad imagining, wrong seeing of the self and the other. And yet, for all its capacity for death-dealing distortion, language is a gift of God, offered back to God, infused with the wisdom of the Spirit. Language is capable of painting new vistas of possibility. And let's face it, if we cannot articulate new hope for the future, what have we got to step into? Maybe that's part of our job as preachers. Part of our job is to paint those alternative vistas of possibility. The writer of the book of Proverbs had a point when they said, without vision, the people perish. A few years ago, I came across a wonderful book called And Finally Comes the Poet by Walter Brueggemann. Anybody read it? It's a wonderful book. And I was reading the introduction to it. And excuse the way I'm going to put this, because this is exactly how I thought when I got to this bit in the book. I flicked through in the introduction, and I thought to myself, bugger, 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 bugger. This guy is saying everything I've always thought about preaching, but he's saying it so much better than I ever could. He's written the book I wanted to write. And what a wonderful introduction it is. Brueggemann astutely observes that reduced speech leads to reduced lives. And by reduced speech, he means language that trivializes human need and flattens out our capacity to wonder and dream. This is language that mutes the cry of anguish, peddles the snake oil of easy answers, and whispers, all is well, when all is not well. He's speaking about language that snuffs out the candle and whistles in the dark. And in contrast to that kind of language, Brueggemann calls for alternative modes of speech. He's speaking to preachers. He is saying we need to inhabit speech which is artistic, invitational, dramatic, tensive, prophetic, poetic. Speech that peels back the layers of inanity and tedium, disclosing new hope, new possibility, new vision. The language that we use, whatever text we're preaching on, really matters. Used well and in the grace of God, our words can enable people to see through their ears. The writer of James knew this. This is a writer, presumably writing out a letter that will be read out. He's well aware of the importance of writing for the ear, and we'll see that as we go along. So, high praise for the power of the spoken word with some caveats. I wonder where that leaves you. What do you think about that? Is it a vision that inspires you? Or do you think, come on, language hasn't got that much power? Have you been to our church? Have you listened to the sermons? What do you think? I want to encourage you to think of yourself as a preacher, as an artist. You are a theologian artist. Your sermons are works of art. That might seem like a scary thing, but when you're next working on a sermon and you're shaping it out and you're sanding it and curving the edges, you're trying to find a way that it'll hook, that's an artistic thing to do. Preaching is not like writing a lecture. It shouldn't be. You know, great long, you've heard them, haven't you? Those sermons with great long sentences with 95 subclauses in that nobody can possibly hold on to. What you do as preachers is much more like writing for the radio, for the ear. So, there's Brueggemann calling for these alternative modes of speech, dramatic, artistic, invitational, etc., etc.
What was the name of the book again?
And finally comes The Poet, by Walter Brueggemann. So it's all wonderful, isn't it? Brueggemann, fantastic, this wonderful way, oh yeah, brilliant, brilliant. And you read on and you're left kind of thinking, dear Walter Brueggemann, how? That was great. I was delighted when I realised he doesn't actually tell you how to do it, because it was an open goal for me to begin, as an ex-English teacher, to begin thinking about that. I don't know about you, but I wrestle. I want to write, in the grace of God, sermons that ignite the heart. I want to offer to the church sermons in which the listeners lean in. Tell us more. Sermons that bind the hearers together effectively in the nod of recognition. I know what that's like. The burst of wry laughter. The courage to name hard truths. Yeah, it is so. It is like that. And the desire to work together to live a better life in the grace of God. Speech that lifts up our vision to a better future, that connects people to the deepest desire of the human heart. And that's the same whether you're in a comedy club or a church. The deepest desire of the human heart is God. So how do you do this? I think that the writer of James also wanted people to see through the ear. There's so much here that we can learn from the work of the poet. And I think the writer of the book of James, whoever he is something of a poet. Strong case here for the argument that preaching is a lyrical thing. So something that I call lyrical preaching is not an argument that all of our preaching is poetry. Oh, please no. But it is emphatically an argument that we can learn from the artistry of the poet, from the literary techniques and devices that the poet employs. Now, a poem is too dense for a sermon because the hearer can't scan back up. You know how it is with a poem. You need to chew it, don't you, and go back through it and weave through it. You can't do that in a piece of verbal discourse. In fact, in experimenting with the idea of lyrical poetry, I once wrote a sermon trying to go for the poetic, but completely over-egged it, piled images on top of images on top of images, and it was like a kind of three-course meal served up on the same plate. So we need to remember that restraint is important here. But that doesn't mean that imagery isn't important. Lyrical preaching recognizes the power of language to lift and reshape vision. And in the age of the digital, the fast-moving image, the all-pervasive camera, the lyrical voice doggedly champions the disclosive power of the written word, of the spoken word. And at the heart of lyrical preaching is a desire to help people to see through their ears. So I've got 10 techniques which we can use to help people to do that, which every now and then I will earth into James. And you've got them on your handout, but I'm just going to go through them and, unpack them a little bit more. I'm going to talk quite quickly. I've got loads of information I want to get through, but I'm aware that that could become quite tedious. And at any point you can go, tedious card, shut up. We need to have a break in the discussion, all right? So this is your session. I'm just going to keep going, yeah? I'm like that. You know those dolls with you pull the wire and off they go? I'm like one of them, all right? And unless you intervene, I'll just keep on going, okay? So if you get to the end of it and you say, boy, she talked too much, it's your fault, okay? Because you didn't interrupt. Number 1, using language with multi-sensory appeal. Language which is trying to help the hearer imaginatively to see or hear, smell, touch, and taste. This is very similar to radio speech, speech written for the ear. Listen to this. This is a tiny little excerpt from the work of a World War II American war correspondent called Ed Murrow. I'll read it out to you. Just listen. Don't worry about reading the thing in the handout. Listen to it. What can you see? What can you hear? What feelings does the description evoke? Remember, this was for a radio report. And he's writing about the effect. A bomb's just gone off. And he's writing about the immediate effect of that. He says, "One night last week, I stood in front of a smashed grocery store and heard a dripping inside. It was the only sound in all London. 2 cans of peaches had been drilled through by flying glass, and the juice was dripping down onto the floor." In an economy of words, he has painted a very, very powerful picture. We can see and hear through that word of the peach juice dripping. That's the focal point. He's using onomatopoeia. Do you remember that from school days? A sound that sounds like the sound it makes. Really useful technique. He uses hyperbole, which is exaggeration for effect. It was the only sound in all London. No, it wasn't. There were loads of other sounds. But he focuses in and exaggerates it. So he's almost asking us to zone in and zone in and zone in on that can and the drip, drip, drip. He's painting something very haunting here. The only sound in London. It's haunting, it's evocative. We've got a verbal, visual close-up on the syrup drops. A sense of violence is captured in the verb drilling and the flying glass. With a breathtaking economy of words, the reporter has painted a scene of destruction and waste without over-describing it. I work with brand new preachers, and often what they do is they overplay it. Tell them what you're going to say it, tell them again. No, don't, because it's really boring. All right, we've already heard it once. You don't have to say it 3 times. Those are, and often for some people that's fine. It works in some sermons, but actually cut and cull and get it crisp and clear. Writer of James also uses multi-sensory language. Consider these quotations. Chapter 1, verse 6. "The one who doubts is like the wave of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind." It's a breathtaking economy of words. You can see it, can't you? You can see the wave of the sea. There's sight, there's hearing, there's a sense of movement. This person goes one way, then the other way. But it's the image that's done that. Or 1, 9 to 11. "The rich will disappear like a flower of the field, for the sun rises with its scorching heat and withers the field. Its flower falls and its beauty perishes." we're being given a kind of word picture. It's very physical, very visual. And that's there in chapter 1, verse 26, where he speaks of the urge to bridle the tongue. You can start to see it, what that might look like. So the writer of James is using imagery to help people to see through their ears. Another interesting thing you'll find in lyrical preaching is you need to use verbs to paint vivid pictures, not adjectives. When you were at school, and your English teacher said, you need to describe it. Use more adjectives are describing words. Use more describing words in your writing. If you're preaching, don't. I'll tell you why. Have a look at these two examples about Zacchaeus. This, Richard Esslinger in his little book, Pitfalls in Preaching. Which of these is the most effective? Zacchaeus was very short, even for people of his day. When he came to see Jesus, the large and bustling crowd was an impenetrable wall of humanity. Then a brilliant idea hit him. He carefully climbed up an old sycamore tree and sat balanced in one of its sturdy limbs. Compare that, full of adjectives, to this. Watch Zacchaeus peering over the crowd, trying to glimpse Rabbi Jesus. Nah, short stuff, he tells himself. This won't work, never does. So there he is, out of costume for climbing trees. But look, he's hoisted himself up onto that branch, and there he's perched, surveying the scene over the heads of all those common folk down below. Can you see the difference? That the adjectives clutter up. As you listen, they get in the way, they clutter, whereas the verbs draw you in. And actually, it's very clever the way that this particular preacher has used language. The verbs, 3 of the verbs, are aimed at the hearer, telling the hearer what to do. Watch. It's a command, isn't it? He tells, implicitly telling the hearer to listen in. And look, the commanding. So it's almost as though that second example, the writer's almost, the preacher is almost saying, there's a screen. Let's look at the movie. Let's look at the film of what happened. So if you're describing something in any sermon, it's much more immediate and vivid if you use verbs. Esslinger calls adjectives, I like this, homiletic cotton candy. Create a load of fluff and get in the way, and you don't want them. Okay, imagery. Can we just push into 3? So we've got simile, which is using as or like to compare one thing to another thing, to compare A or B, to give us an insight on that principal thing. From James, for if any are hearers of the word and not doers, they are like those who look at themselves in the mirror. For they look at themselves and on going away, immediately forget what they look like. That's a pretty concise and effective simile. And here's a thought, when you're preaching from James, maybe that passage, it's not a bad image he's got, but could you come up with a better one that would be more resonant in your context? So I've been playing around with one just today. So I teach in a university context, and I'm going to say to my guys, right, I want you to imagine 2 students in the library. And one student, he's sitting there, he's got a book open, he's skimming through it, drinking a bit of water, a bit of sneaky chocolate while no one's looking at his smartphone, he's a bit distracted, looking at the clock. You know, skim, off. Another one's in there, he's got his book open, his text, he's taking some notes, he's checking something online, running down a reference, asking some questions, gets to the end of his study session, he's written himself 3 critical questions he wants to take on. Both students go out into the dining room. And a third party says, so what have you been doing today? First student, I was in the library. What did you learn? Oh, I don't know, some bloke. Something about, I don't know, I think it was atonement, something to do with God. I can't remember. Second student, what were you looking at? And he talks in depth about the thing that is shaping his thinking and his understanding. Now that extended metaphor is effectively what James is trying to do. I'm trying to play with another one to do with deep sea diving and water skiing, to see if we can get that sense of skimming the surface or dropping down into the deeps. But what might you use that would work in your context? metaphor got the power to enable new ways of seeing and potentially new ways of acting in the world. And metaphor, I remember doing some work with this with a group of students, and one of the students said, "Oh, don't give me all this metaphor stuff, Kate. That's all just frilly language. You don't need frilly language in a sermon. You just need to crack on and be direct." So I said to him, "Okay, I'll give you a statement and I'll give you a metaphor. And you tell me if the metaphor is just frilly and ornamental." And I said to him, "Here's the statement. There is smoke coming under that door." Here's the metaphor. There is smoke creeping under that door. Is the second one just ornamentation? Or is the second one doing something that the statement didn't do? What do you hear? That's right, you can talk to me.
Much more menace.
There's more menace, isn't there? There's something insidious and creeping. So don't buy the argument that metaphor is just frilly language. It's not. Metaphor in public speech is incredibly powerful. Let me give you an example that I came across in a book. This occurs in the context of a court case. It's a court hearing. There's a large firm is defending a lawsuit from a smaller firm and apparently winning. And then the lawyer for the smaller firm, my accent's terrible, this was in the southern United States, so I'm just warning you now. The lawyer for the smaller utility stands up in front of the jury, almost as if it's just incidental to the legal case. And he says to the jury, "So, now we see what it is. They got us where they want us. They're holding us up with one hand with that good sharp fishing knife in the other hand, and they saying, 'You just sit still, little catfish. We're just gonna get you.'" Apparently that's a true story, and apparently it turned the case. Because the penny drops and the power dynamics are thrown into relief by metaphor, by colloquial language. The unfairness of the case is brought to new light. What about James and metaphor? I'm going to chuck over to you for a minute. Could you have a look at, just look up James chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. And question for you, and I'll give you a few minutes to do this. How many metaphors can you spot? James chapter 3, 1 through 6. And what are they doing, these metaphors? Are they effective? What are they doing? What are they trying to communicate? So let's look at how James is using imagery. Fourth thing about this kind of communication is that you weave imagery into the flow of familiar conversational language. So in the example I gave you, "They're just going to get you, little catfish." That would have been familiar conversational language in its context. But look at what James is doing. Pete said it earlier. You know, he's picking his images from the everyday run of life. The imagery of the everyday. Alert to the power of hyperbole. Remember our guy, Ed Murrow, exaggeration for effect? It was the only sound in the whole of London. James is using exaggeration for effect too. Chapter 2, verses 6 through 7. He layers up repetition to make his point. "But you have dishonored the poor. Is it not the rich who oppress you? Is it not they who drag you into court? Is it not they who blaspheme the excellent name that was invoked over you? Is it not? Is it not? Is it not?" Building up, building up, building up. He does it again when he's talking about the deadly power of the tongue in chapter 3. We just referred to that. "How great a forest is set ablaze by a small fire, and the tongue is a fire. The tongue is placed among our members as a world of iniquity. It stains the whole body, sets on fire the cycle of nature, and is itself set on fire by hell." Layer, 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 layer. To get us across this sense of the destructive power of the tongue. Another thing to be thinking about in your preaching is to come down the ladder of abstraction, right? Preachers have a habit of talking in generalities. It's easy for us to do this. So I could say to you, God calls us to love one another. Yeah. And what does that mean? That's up here, isn't it? So as preachers, we need to come down the ladder of abstraction. Gogol said, show me the egg stain on his waistcoat, and you'll have shown me the man. Focus in, earth it. So in your sermons, use instances. They're slices of real life to earth the point you're trying to make. Let me give an example. So here's a generality. God calls us to seek the lost with him. Okay, no one's going to argue with that. But what does that look like where we live? That woman at the school gate who's always on her own. The neighbour who can't get out anymore. The kid bullied, pushed around in the playground. That lonely single mum. That fellow who drinks special brew in the cemetery every day. So-and-so's daughter who's still doing time. God comes to seek the lost. All of them and all of us. Can you see generality, but it's earthed in the specifics. Now, that actually is from a real sermon, and the interesting thing was, I just came up with those. I didn't know the context I was preaching in, so I went for generalities. You know, most areas, but don't quote me on this, a lot of areas local to where I live might have a bloke in the drinking special brew in the cemetery. Turns out this area did, and the church had reached out to him, and he did drink special brew. And so the actual, it was just incredible. Coming down the ladder of abstraction actually hit a truth. I hadn't intended it to, but great that it did. But if I just said, hey, everybody, let's seek the lost, everybody would have gone, yeah, we've heard it all before, yada, yada, yada. What does that mean? James, well, Jesus does as well. James uses instances as well, little slices of life to make a point. Chapter 2, verses 2 to 4. If a person with gold rings and in fine clothes comes into your assembly, and if a poor person in dirty clothes comes in, and if you take notice of the one wearing fine clothes and say, have a seat here, please, while to the one who is poor you say, stand here or sit at my feet, have you not made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? That slice of life that he's banged into his letter, I think that's real. I think he's saying, I've seen you do it. We do this kind of thing. But if he just said, do you know, guys, we should treat everyone the same, rich or poor, shouldn't we? Yeah, we should do that, shouldn't we? But he hasn't, he said, and do you know what? We don't. And it could almost have been him saying, you know, like last week. It's so specific and particular to that community. What about language itself? A lyrical preacher, an artistic preacher, understands the musicality of language, rhythm, repetition, alliteration, onomatopoeia. Are you happy with alliteration? Happy, hopeless, hapless people who are hamstrung? Alliteration, that repetition, I overuse it actually in my sermons. I did an analysis recently on rhetorical techniques I was using in a range of sermons, and boy, oh boy, do I use alliteration too much. But I wouldn't have known if I hadn't done the analysis. So, this was from, just a little example from a sermon on Ezekiel 37 that was trying to listen playfully to the way that language can conjure up a scene. Ezekiel 37, we're in the Valley of the Dry Bones. Okay. And this was an attempt to describe, if we'd gone to the Valley of the Dry Bones in our time machine and stepped out, what would we have seen? Skulls seeking jawbones, tibias linking with fibulas. This is the point at which everything starts moving. Tarsals marrying metatarsals, ribs and spines, hips and femurs rattling about, kneecaps flying through the air, click, clack, rattle. Bones are on the move. There was a little bit of just trying in a playful kind of way to you know, that wonderful and strange scene of the bones coming together. What about this was an example of, I was trying to communicate in a way that I wanted the language to punch it, our irritation when things don't go our way. Oh, we stamp our feet and blast our horns and slam the phone down, short-fused, short-sighted, short on humour. Just letting the language do a lot of the work for me rather than going into a whole paragraph. sometimes we have a tendency to lose our temper, don't we, when things don't quite go our way. Blah, 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 blah. And, you know, before you know it, you're like a primary school teacher talking down to people instead of a preacher talking next to people. So I want people to go, yeah, I'm a bit like that. I slammed the phone down on whoever it was who rang me up trying to sell double glazing or blah, blah, blah. Not that that's a sin. That's a forgiven one. Varying line length for punchy effect. I set out my sermons like I've done these notes. So I do it on an A4 landscape in 2 columns. If this was a sermon, well, you can see here there's a bit of a sermon. The lines, it doesn't look like an essay. It looks more like a piece of free poetry. What I'm trying to do is let the sermon lengths help me with the mood and the tone. And also it means that I'm being careful that I'm not starting to write an essay. I'm not getting into sub-clauses. So listen to this one. And this is a deliberate attempt to vary line length for punchy effect. On the brink of the season of excess, John the Baptist's voice cuts through the growing aroma of mulled wine and mince pies. Never mind the Iceland and the M&S ads. John gives us winnowing forks and unquenchable fire, penitence, judgment, provocative themes, challenging, troubling, scary. John. You can see that how I'm trying to make, because I also work with the text, it's easier for me to have it set out like that, because I can, you know, if you don't work with the text in the same way, you'd have to find a different way of doing it. It's probably more natural, actually, because you've got speech patterns which are naturally broken up. James does the same thing. Chapter 4, verses 7 through 10. He's very directive, and the length of his lines, and I know we're working with a translation, but the translator will be trying to communicate what the original was doing. Submit yourselves, therefore, to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Lament, and mourn, and weep. Let your laughter be turned into mourning, and your joy into dejection. Can you see what he's doing? Sorry, it's a Trumpism again, isn't it? They're sneaking in all the time, these, aren't they? Get off! And I think, you know, we can take a leaf out of James here. Not literally. We're not going to do a Pete Phillips threat to destroy the Bible. So yeah, avoid over lengthy sentences. And this is one of the things that I tend to, and you know this, if you're working with a new preacher, if you take somebody under your wing, often they have long sentences because they're trying to communicate weighty things and they want to do it in a weighty kind of way. And actually for us poor listeners, it's really hard to hold a sub-clause here before you get to the main clause over there. I've lost it. And just be kind. One thing I'd often say to beginner preachers is just remember that your hearer doesn't have the luxury of being able to scan back up the page. If it's gone, it's gone. There's no going back. And if you lose them, chances are you're not going to be able to pick them up again. And finally of my 10 tips is cull the empty calorie language. Empty calorie language is an expression that Richard Esslinger has. So for those of you who are full scripters, go back through a full script with a red pen, and yes, red, not green, we're being harsh. Get rid of any language that's a filler. Truly, very, really, awfully, only, I just want to. If only we might. So that's really sermon speak, isn't it? If only we could, if only we might. Get rid of it. Shoulds and oughts, get rid of them. And my own pet peeve, this just drives me up the wall. Each and every one of us. What's wrong with all of us? It's just that nobody ever says that in real, you know, each and every one of us in Tesco or you know, all of us in Tesco. Is the phrase or are the words doing something? Yeah. And if the answer is yes, keep them in. Yeah. If they're just kind of filler, get rid of them. You don't need, how many of us, you know, preached for 20 minutes, but we could have done it in 10 if we got rid of the fillers, you know? Anyway, that's probably just me being... And religious jargon. I've worked with a wonderful, wonderful, probably one of the finest young preachers in the country. And I still shoot her down in flames. She has big platforms, you know, that's what they call them now, a big platform. So, you know, like New Wine or, I never get invited to those big platforms, I don't know what they are. But she goes and she's great and I get to mentor her. But I sometimes say to her, what are you doing with language? Have a heart for. What in heaven's name does that mean in the real world? And I say to her, put your religious jargon through the Tesco test. Tesco test is, I'm standing in the queue at Tesco, is this the kind of language I would use to the people either side of me? Would I do that? I've got a real heart for chocolate. You wouldn't say it, would you? It's true, but I would never confess it. I've got a real heart for gin. And because I don't know, I'm not actually a Methodist, but I am. What's the phrase when they stand up in your big and say that person there, that Anglican there's. Yeah, I am actually authorised to serve it is now, believe it or not, which is a worry. You Methodists should be very worried. Are you short of clergy or something? You're scraping the bottom of the barrel now. But just watch, be very careful. I don't know whether Methodists, do you have like Methodist language that only people in Methodism understand? Because what you're saying when you use that language is, we're a little club. Yeah. And if you don't get it, that's because you're not part of our club. And I don't have a heart for you. I've given you about 11 or 12, I don't know, I got the numbering wrong, things to do to kind of develop your use of imagery and instances and illustrations when preaching James. So the things like, you know, the rich will disappear like, James says, a flower of the field, or in my case, a flower of the field, because I can't spell. I can't believe I used to be an English teacher. Check your work. You know, and I've said, well, could you adapt his simile and make a different simile out of it? So there's something you could either take that home and do it, and we could do something else now, or you could do this now. Let me give you a hint, though. There's something else that involves a sermon. I thought it'd be useful, as I say, to give you a raw. It's very raw and it's not developed, and so in a sense, you could kind of help me and do the homework at home. Was that? Or just sometimes people say to me, no, we don't want to hear any more from you. Let's do group work, you know, and that's fine too. Okay, well, you've only got yourselves to blame. Seriously, this is very, very raw, and you know, I was playing around with it while Pete was talking this morning, nicking his ideas as we went along, and I'm not sure it works yet. Okay, but that's not the point. I'm not giving this to you as oh look, here's the way to preach James. I'm giving this to you as a bit of raw dough that I'm starting to shape, trying to listen to my own teaching points to you. So let's go for it and see what works and see what doesn't work. One of the things I found in writing this, and I'm afraid because it's quite raw and it's not in me, I may be reading quite a bit of it, so forgive me, is that it's very difficult to get a structure on a sermon on James. So let me read the passage I've been given, and I've also been given some verses from Proverbs in the background. I'm not going to read those because, frankly, I've ignored them. So that's great. Give me a really bitty text, and then a secondary text that's really bitty, and then ask me to preach on both of them. Thanks a lot. It's our chaplain who's going to get beaten up later. Bless her. So this is the text, and it's in a series, and it's been given a title. And the title's not in the passage, and to my mind doesn't really come out of the passage. So you understand, you've been in these situations many times, I'm sure. So I've been given the theme, Living the Word. And I've been given the passage, I've got Proverbs 3, 1-8 in the background, but I haven't used it yet. I may or may not bring that in. And then the passage I've got is James 1, 17-25. So let's have a look at James 1, 17-25, and then talk about some of the difficulties, and then I'll give an example. So, every generous act of giving, with every perfect gift, is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. In fulfillment of his own purpose, he gave us birth by the word of truth, so that we would become a kind of first fruits of his creatures. You must understand this, my beloved. Let everyone be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger, for your anger does not produce God's righteousness. Therefore, rid yourselves of all sordidness and rank growth of wickedness, and welcome with meekness the implanted word that has the power to save your souls. But be doers of the word and not merely hearers who deceive themselves. For if any are hearers of the word and not doers, they are like those who look at themselves in a mirror. For they look at themselves and on going away immediately forget what they were like. But those who look into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and persevere, being not hearers who forget, but doers who act, they will be blessed in their doing. So I read that on the train to London earlier this week, and I thought, it's difficult to preach because what's the structure? Now, I like to preach narrative text because often the structure, you just follow the narrative flow, don't you? There's the structure. Or you preach on a psalm and you can see the movement and developed ideas in the psalm. But here, that was my first problem, and I guess it's going to be a problem that all of us are facing. What do we do? What's legitimate to do? Well, I went for the never despise the three-pointer. If in doubt, a three-pointer can give you a beautiful structure. So I went for that, but you can tell me whether you think it worked or not. So here we go. James is punchy, concise, and to the point. So expect a sermon in a similar style. He also offers something of a scattergun approach. I have tried to impose some order and structure in the sermon, but if it fails, it's all James's fault. Hurrah! Living the Word, that's my title. It's an interesting phrase, isn't it? It's not one found in wider culture, where we might find living the dream or living the vida loca. But living the Word, that's a peculiarly Christian expression. What does it mean? How does James describe the Word? His Christology, the way he talks about Jesus, is pretty underdeveloped. So we need to do a bit of work here. And to be fair to James, I may be imposing a meaning on his text that he would say isn't there. However, James isn't here to argue back. In the text that we heard read, James says that God gave us birth by the word of truth. So we can say that this word is associated with new life. James says the word is planted in us, so we can say that it's dynamic, growing within and needing nurture. James writes that the word has power to save souls. So we can say it's seen not only in material action, but it has spiritual power. James argues that we are to be doers of the word. So we can say that this word needs to be enacted. James never links the word to Jesus, but it seems clear that Jesus is the word, even though James doesn't develop this. And perhaps we can't help but read into James all those other images we've got going on and ideas associated with the word. John 1, the word became flesh and dwelt among us, and so forth. So I want to ask the question, what does it mean to live out the word of Jesus, the word who is Jesus in our lives? To this end, in our passage from James, I think we can identify a call for constancy, courage, and engagement. Never despise a three-point sermon. It's helped me to take James's spaghetti and reshape it into lasagna, 3-layered. Thank you, Pete Phillips. Which I hope will be reasonably digestible. A 3-layered lasagna. Constancy. James says God is constant. There's no shadow of variation in him. God is reliable, trustworthy, dependable. I wonder how we develop God-like constancy. How might you and I reflect God's character in our lives? Okay, I accept that's a lofty aim, but Right after describing God's constancy and describing us as the first fruits of God's creation, James launches into some practical challenges, urging us to be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger. Is this the way then that God's first fruits reflect something of God's constancy? Just as an aside, anger in James's assessment does not produce righteousness. I get the impression he's thinking of that kind of snippy, bolshy anger that kind of erupts in a hurry when we feel offended or affronted, rather than that more measured, moral anger on behalf of the oppressed and the poor. There's a call here for watchful self-awareness. Am I quick to listen? Or am I quicker to lob in my 2 halfpenny worth? Am I too hasty to have my say, to wade in and exert my power? Do I fly off the handle easily, all defensive and all edgy? Or am I learning to pause, to be a bit more measured, to learn to zip it? Do I hit send on that snippy email, or do I just pause for a moment? Do I fire off the defensive tweet, or do I just wait for a minute? How can I be more constant, more reliable, more grounded in God? I think the truth is that we all take steps forward and back in this area, but maybe a greater degree of self-awareness and a willingness to start over are essential as we learn to grow into a more measured constancy, essential to living the world with a word, essential in a world context where constancy is an increasingly rare thing, where we witness, for example, Donald Trump throwing all the toys out of the pram with rage and impunity because they lied about the number of people who came to his party. This is a world context in which there is great insecurity. And against this, we're called to be a people of constancy, grounded in God, looking to God. We are invited to inhabit a secure and secure-making constancy. Lord Jesus, show us who we are and how to grow more constant, more steady, more grounded in you. Constancy. Courage. For James, living the word takes courage. It means putting on your overalls. It means rolling up your sleeves. It means going out into the garden of our lives, individually and corporately, and doing some weeding. Now you might say, why does that take courage? Another metaphor from James. Therefore, rid yourself, get the language of this, buckle up for a minute, get the language. Rid yourselves of all sordidness and rank growth of wickedness, and welcome with meekness the implanted word that has the power to save your souls. It's really hard to go weeding in our soul garden, if you like, if we don't accept that there are any weeds there in the first place. That's not a weed, that's a rare flower. It takes great courage, doesn't it, to name the weeds. The personal ones, the community weeds, and the political weeds that choke the poor. And James takes no prisoners here. In referring to all sordidness and rank growth of wickedness, we are being invited into some courageous, careful, deep, and brave self-examination and communal evaluation. Have we got the courage to pray where there are sordid weeds, where there are clumps of wickedness in myself, in our community? Help us to remove them. Have I got the courage to pray it and to do it? Courage. Engagement. Picture the inside of our library. That's the building just over there, for those of you who've never been. There are 2 students. One seems restless, sits in the library, fiddles with his phone, watches the clock, sneaky bite of chocolate, opens a book, flicks through, yada, 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 blah, 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 atonement theory, yak, yak, yak. After a while, he's off. And a friend bumps into him later and says, oh, been to the library, have you? What have you been working on? The ensuing conversation is a tad short. Something to do with some bloke, something to do, I don't know, atonement, what's it? Not sure, something to do with God. The other student is focused, takes notes, pauses to scribble down some questions, jots down some ideas, useful quotations, stops, rereads a section, concentrates really closely on the text. The person is deeply and profoundly engaged. They finish their study session, but they note down the things they want to follow up later. This stuff really matters. It's not just about the head. It's about the head and the heart. It's about all of it, what it all means. And before long, they find themselves in the common room, in deep conversation with a friend, chewing over the ideas that were triggered in the library session. Their study has made a deep impression on them, and they haven't forgotten it. It's shaped their thoughts, their interaction. It's shaping their prayers. Maybe we've all been both students. The passive hoop jumper, skimming the surface, forgetful, nothing really sticks. And the active, engaged learner, swimming in the deeps, switched on, focused, remembering. Can we pray today? God, draw us into deeper engagement with you. Help us to gaze upon you, to go deep into prayer, contemplation, and on the back of that, action in the world. So, living the word. There are two people. They're in the ocean. One of them is water skiing. This guy is skimming over the surface fast. I mean, he is the real deal. He looks the part. Yeah, he's doing the odd trick here and there. He's impressive, the water skier. And just over there is a deep sea diver. First time out with their instructor. Together they'd slip unseen over the side of the boat and into the deeps. The instructor is close at hand. And together they explore the depths of the ocean. Our novice diver is growing in confidence as she follows the expert into the deep places. Who are we? Who am I? Do I skim over Christian life and commitment, looking the part? Do I genuflect with the best of them? Or do I raise holy hands at the appropriate chord change with an all's well with me and the Lord smile on my face? Is that what I'm doing? Do I chunter along with the liturgy, mouthing the words with my tongue, but with my heart cold and disengaged? Am I water skiing through the life of faith? Look at me, I'm the real deal. Pious platitudes, skin deep, no actual engagement, no expressing the gospel in any kind of action. Or am I quietly intentional? Am I willing to go to the deep places of challenge with constancy, courage, and engagement, willing to take risks for God, willing to dive in to the unknown, heart deep, into the challenges of living the word in practical and risky ways? What does it all mean, living the word? Proverbs, James, saying similar things. How we are shaped internally, how we allow things to shape us internally, affect how we interact with the world. James's argument is that how you act can be traced right back to who you are. There are some similarities with the book of Proverbs, where we're urged to write the commandments on the tablets of our hearts. The heart steers our action. So living the word starts with healing the heart. So we're invited, all of us, to open our hearts to God and address three issues. Constancy. Show us how you see us, Lord. Teach us how to grow more constant, more steady, more grounded in you. Oh God, teach me to zip it. Honesty. Okay, Lord, where are the sordid weeds? I'm not saying they're not there. I'm not sharing them with this congregation, but you and I know. Lord, show us the clumps of wickedness and help us remove them. Honesty, engagement. God, would you draw us deep into prayer and contemplation and action? Show us how to be doers of the word, here in college, in our wider university, our churches, in our families, friendship groups. And most of all, show us how to be doers of the word with the people we find most difficult. Living the word, then, a matter of constancy, courage, and engagement, deeply, deeply grounded in the rule of God. So just stop for a minute. What have you heard? Don't close the book of the sermon and walk off. Take a minute to gaze at yourself in the mirror of these words. What do you see? What is the Lord saying to you, to me? Pause, be silent. And if God has spoken deeply to you, do something about it. Maybe in your prayers as you come to the table to receive communion. Maybe in prayer ministry as communion is distributed. Maybe in that decision to actively engage with God's word once again. God, shape us in constancy. Give us your courage and help us to engage actively with you in the service of the world. Amen. How long was that? Felt too long. 15, okay. So what I do now is I just need to get myself out of the head of preacher. Remember, you have a go at me, your sermon, you're killing me. So I just need to go and take a few deep breaths over there and just reconnect a sense of humour. And then you need to have a buzz about what you've heard. And then without the preachers over there then, I'm not there. Okay, so you can say what you like. All right, so first version, raw dough. What works? What are you going to nick? Right, that's is there anything in that worth nicking? Nick it. Is there anything in that where you think, that didn't work? Actually, what would you say to me as the preacher? Seriously, tweak that, didn't work. So any questions and thoughts? Remembering it's a work in progress. All right, so you have a little buzz and a little chat. I'll clear off and finish my tea and find a sense of humour again. Thank you. Well, I wish you well. It's not easy, is it, James? Goodness me. So I bless you in all your need to find ingenious frameworks to impose some lasagna order on this spaghetti. But thank you for your indulgence and your indulgence and your time. I don't know about you, but I've had a great time with you, so thank you very much. Thank you.